Hi, everyone. Thanks for hopping on, being the early birds. We'll get started a minute or two after 4.
Thanks all for those that have joined already. We're just going to give another minute for folks to roll in and we'll get started very soon. Thanks. All right, I think we get started now. We see a good number of folks joining in. Thank you all for joining us today. For those that join us for the first time, I'll give a very brief introduction to what this community of practice is and what we're hoping to accomplish together in these bi-weekly webinars. For those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Carlos Diaz. I'm a director at Hadaway Communications, and along with my colleagues at Hadaway, including my colleague Caroline Jaros, we serve as the secretariat for the STAT communications community. This community grew out of the work of the State and Territory Alliance for Testing, which is a group of 26 states and territories convened by the Rockefeller Foundation, who share insights, best practices, successful strategies, and lessons learned on all aspects of the COVID response. And the goal for expanding this community and the motivation for these bi-weekly meetings, as they have been for almost a year now, is to bring the same spirit of collaboration that has made STAT such a success to the broader community working on COVID communications. A second motivation is to bring the same rigor and science that informs other aspects of the COVID response to strategic communications. That's why we're very excited today to chat with the Virality Project, which is a coalition of research entities focused on supporting real-time information exchange between the research community, public health officials, government agencies, civil society organizations, and social media platforms. We know this topic has been a hot topic in some of these webinars, so these folks have a lot of good stuff to share with you today. I'll just give a few introductions to who is joining us from the Virality Project and the hashtag This Is Our Shot initiative. We have from the Virality Project, we have Elena Christ, we have Sarin Karasian, we have Chase Small, and we have Zoe Huchok. And then from the hashtag This Is Our Shot initiative, we have Dr. Atul Nakasi, who will be joining briefly on camera as his turn to present comes on. And they'll be sharing today information on identifying vaccine hesitancy narratives and tropes to help communications stay ahead of the curve, a case study on how anti-vaccine activists use social media to recycle and spread disinformation narratives. And we'll also hear from Dr. Atul Nakasi on how to address these narratives in conversations with patients, which we know have also been a few questions about that in some of our previous webinars. As we go, we really encourage you to leave your thoughts, experiences, and questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, whichever one you prefer, and we'll make sure to gather those as we go along and get those answered. I will turn it over to the Virality Project team. Again, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Carlos. It's really great to be here. My name is Alina Christ, and I am the Assistant Director of the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is a research lab at Stanford that focuses on detecting and preventing abuse on social media platforms in real time. Next, please. So to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of what we're doing here, I wanted to back up a year ago. So just about 1 year ago, the Internet Observatory decided to partner with 3 other peer research institutions that all focus on, broadly speaking, on misinformation online, to sort of Captain Planet reference intended, combine our powers and create what we called the Election Integrity Partnership. This partnership was designed to detect and mitigate attempts to undermine credibility and trust in the US election in 2020. We, at the end of that project, published a almost 300-page report, which is available on our website. But of course, we're not here to talk about this today. The reason I wanted to mention this is because after doing this partnership, we found that the collaboration between these entities was so successful that we wanted to look at how we could use this infrastructure that we had built to look at COVID-19 vaccine misinformation. So we brought in a few other amazing partners into this project. Of particular note, the National Council on Citizenship and a project they have within their organization called Junkipedia, the New York University Tandon School of Engineering, and another research lab at NYU that focuses on social media and policy. So we came together and decided to focus our efforts more directly on mitigating attempts to undermine public confidence in the COVID-19 vaccines and the vaccine rollouts. I want to emphasize upfront that our position here is on identifying and sharing misinformation that we're seeing spread online. We don't engage in a counter messaging role. We leave that largely to the extensive network of partners that we've cultivated and we work with. So we've worked with both partners in government, civil society, other academic institutions, and platforms. And I'll let I'm going to turn this over in a second to my colleague Chase, and he's going to talk a lot more about some of the examples of things we've done. And then at the end, I'll come back and give you guys a little bit of a sense of where we're going in the coming months. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Chase.
Thanks so much, Elena. So I want to talk a little bit about our work and sort of in the day-to-day of our analysis, we track community discussions using, looking at public groups and pages, and we use keyword searches across platforms to get a sense of the spread of vaccine hesitancy narratives online. So this includes creating lists of actors we know fuel these vaccine hesitancy narratives and scoped queries based on narratives we anticipate seeing. And so largely we're able to track these emerging narratives because the big idea here is anti-vaccine activists are largely not creative. The narratives that they're using online, the points they drive home, the tropes that they use to drive home these points, they've been consistent throughout the vaccine rollout for COVID and are similar to those that we've seen with other vaccines in the past. So I want to take a couple minutes today to dive into the 4 main categories of narratives we've been seeing and expect to continue to see with this rollout, and then take a couple minutes to dive into one case study that I think really exemplifies how these reoccurring tropes play out on social media. So we track these 4 main narratives around vaccines, and we can expect to see all these sorts of narratives continue on just as they've been occurring. And the largest of these is concerns around vaccine safety. This has been a huge point of focus for anti-vaccine activists throughout COVID and for other vaccines. It's raising the perceived risk of getting vaccinated for individual safety. And in the instances of COVID in particular, we've been seeing a lot of individual stories of people who have been had serious side effects or deaths after being vaccinated. And these stories pose a unique content moderation challenge because a lot of times these stories might be factually accurate and that people do die after receiving a vaccine, but it's very difficult to establish a causation. And usually there is no causation between the vaccine and their death. Still, the personal nature, the tragic nature of these individual stories allows these to flourish online. And again, the implied connection in the headlines that get spread throughout social media raise the perceived risk of getting vaccinated. The second sort of main area of narratives we see has to do around efficacy and necessity of vaccines. So most recently, we've seen a lot of discussion around concerns or the idea of natural immunity. And this is, again, one of those tropes that's been used for decades in the anti-vaccine community, which is the idea that our natural immunity, our natural immune system response is better and safer than getting vaccines. And this has been playing out largely in the online space around recently around the question of if people who have already had COVID, if they need to be vaccinated. And we've seen a lot of bad actors who are trying to sort of question vaccines and question the need for vaccines, sort of exploit this discussion and try and push the idea that any sort of promotion of vaccines for everyone is wrong and is in bad faith. Sort of building off of that, a third category here has to do with distribution. And this is largely driven by the idea of health freedom, medical freedom. There's a big organizing movement online of people that don't necessarily explicitly announce themselves as anti-vaccine, but instead focus on the fight against vaccine mandates, or as we've been seeing largely with the COVID vaccines, the idea of vaccine passports. So what they do is exploit this very legitimate discussion about, it's an ethical public health discussion about how to best determine, who's vaccinated to create safe COVID-free spaces in our society. And they exploit that discussion by, again, amplifying perceived risks of the vaccine and really driving home a fear of government overreach and personal freedoms with vaccine rollouts. And then finally, we see a lot of discussions about conspiracy theories that have to do with vaccines. You've probably heard of microchips or the idea that the vaccine is this end times mark of the beast. And these, I think, have gotten a lot of traction in sort of the popular discourse as, wow, look at how outrageous the ideas of anti-vaxxers can be. But it's important to note that a lot of the times the seriousness, this is only taken seriously in sort of smaller, more fringe groups. And really there's a big need to focus on the other categories that might get less attention. But big idea here is we can expect to see, continue to see these similar narratives. And we need to continue to proactively communicate to these general themes of these narratives rather than react after it's too late. So if I could get the next slide here. So it gives you sort of an overview of the narratives we're seeing, but I wanted to dive into one specific case study that I think has been pretty outrageous. And I think it's a case study that really exemplifies how it's difficult to know if something is going to be serious or not. And we really have to take these emerging misinformation threats online seriously. So if you could click next. So this is the magnet challenge. And for those of you who are not familiar, and I hope most of you are not familiar with this, this began sort of late April, early May. We started seeing videos of people putting magnets on their vaccine sites to suggest that there was something in the vaccine that was making people magnetic. And these early on videos were, a lot of them were at the border of satire and making fun of anti-vaccine beliefs, but some of them were really in bad faith, and whatever the intention, the impact was pretty stunning. You click next. Yeah. Less than a month later, in the Ohio State Legislature, anti-vaccine activists were citing this as an actual phenomenon, as reasons that the vaccine might not be safe. And this was a discussion against vaccine mandates. And here's a famous or infamous anti-vaccine activist. And I know there were some videos going around of people, putting keys on themselves to try and prove that this was real. So it's important to look at this case study, because I think it really exemplifies how the online environment mixed with a reoccurring anti-vaccine trope can really allow, something that initially seems preposterous to actually gain hold in online discourse. So if you could just click next again. During this time, during this month-long period, that magnet challenge was amplified across all major platforms. And the reason this spread largely had to do with sort of the participatory nature of this challenge. It really invited people to try this out for themselves and generate their own original content. So we saw hundreds of videos being created of people sticking, small metal objects to their arms. And there are so many reasons that an object might stick to your arm other than a vaccine being magnetic, including using tape or something else of that nature, and even videos of satirical intent. People intending to make fun of the magnet challenge had the impact of spreading this hashtag, elevating this across the board. And it was difficult to determine if some of these videos were satirical or serious. And this first video that was up on May 9th, the first viral video, I should say, was up on TikTok for 4 days and received over 9 million views during that time. So whatever the intention, gained a lot of traction. But then the key element here is not just that it spread, but it took hold. And people really took this seriously because it played off of a reoccurring anti-vaccine trope. And that's the idea that there is something in vaccines, an ingredient in vaccines that's dangerous, often metallic. If you think of, thimerosal or the idea that there's aluminum, mercury in these vaccines, this is something that's been used for vaccines for decades, not just for COVID vaccines. And so this sort of together, created this sort of data deficit where people were unsure about what was happening. Was this a hoax? Was this real? And the big takeaway here is that, the kind of pro-vaccine movement was slow to respond. The videos stayed up, the communication spaces were instead filled by anti-vaccine explanations for all this. So hopefully that gives you a little snapshot into how some of this stuff can flourish online. And I want to turn it over now to Zareen to talk about where the online discussion is headed.
Thanks, Chase. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the new directions that we've seen so far in terms of where the conversation is headed and what we expect to see in the coming months. As vaccine access has expanded to children over the age of 12, the focus online has really shifted to childhood vaccination and has used the same tropes we have been seeing in other contexts. Most anti-vaccine related content related to the vaccination of children has focused on narratives that question the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. So these have included claims that administering vaccines in clinical trials to children is unethical human experimentation, or that children who are in the vaccine trial are experiencing harmful side effects. So these claims are often include few details and are based on unverified self-reports. In one instance, for example, there was a story about a 2-year-old who purportedly died after a Pfizer shot, and it was reported by Natural News, a prominent anti-vaccine website. And it turns out the story originated from a unverified and ultimately false report in VAERS, which collects self-reports of vaccine side effects. Another common trope that is unfounded is claims that vaccines are unnecessary for children because the risk of COVID is so small or non-existent, or that children have natural immunity, and there's no evidence for this either. The next thing we've seen, and you can go to the next slide, please, is the convergence of the anti-vaccine tropes targeting childhood vaccination with medical freedom arguments and opposition to vaccine mandates in particular. Many of the active figures of the anti-vaccine movement are longtime opponents of school vaccine and vaccination requirements. And they also have experience operating within parenting communities and drawing adherents from those communities. So this activity has translated offline, especially as schools and universities reopen. For example, earlier in June, parents staged a protest on Indiana University's campus in opposition to the school's vaccine requirement policy. And the protest was actually organized by a local medical freedom group called IU Family for Choice, Not Mandates. We're also seeing other forms of coordinated grassroots action. For example, in this slide, this is a poster to place on one's door to resist the Biden administration's supposed door-to-door vaccine evangelization effort. The impact is also manifesting in increasing attention from public officials and legislative action. For example, Senator Rand Paul announced he would not get the vaccine specifically because he was taking a stance for medical freedom. In another example of this online to offline impact, the Ohio legislature recently passed a bill forbidding vaccine mandates in public schools and colleges. Next slide, please. Lastly, new variants, in particular the Delta variant of the virus, have prompted a new twist on these existing tropes. So we are still seeing categories, the concerns over most of the tropes falling into safety, efficacy, distribution, and conspiracy. But some of the claims are now unique to focusing on the Delta variant in particular. For example, some of the content we've seen has claimed that the vaccines are not effective against the Delta variant when actually they are very effective against hospitalization, as well as claims that the vaccine is unnecessary against the Delta variant. And now I am going to pass it on to Elena, I believe, to talk about, or Zoe to talk about best practices for countering some of these narratives.
Thank you, Zareen. So again, I'll preface this by saying that we're not communicators. However, the analysis of hesitancy narratives that we've conducted has allowed us to draw a number of inferences and have a few recommendations to make for debunking hesitancy narratives before they reach viral spread and cause offline harm. One of those is to focus on themes, not incidents. What we mean by this is there is always a risk in counter messaging to inadvertently amplify the very narrative you're attempting to combat. So for example, if you're trying to debunk a specific narrative that maybe your audience hasn't even heard of, you're actually inadvertently sharing it and increasing its reach. So to that effect, it's often better to talk in terms of themes rather than specific events. For example, better to educate the public about about adverse effects, which do exist, though they remain rare and most of the time, thankfully, mild, rather than putting the spotlight on a very specific, very rare blood disorder that has occurred unfortunately in 2 or 3 people. Our second recommendation is to be upfront about the state of the science when it is evolving. And this is something that we have observed during time and time again during this pandemic. even the most credible, legitimate institutions have learned about the virus throughout the pandemic. One example is, airborne transmission of the virus has been an object of learning, and institutions have changed their minds on this. Another more recent example of evolving consensus is, what exactly are the rates of efficacy of various vaccines against the Delta variant in different settings. So here, our recommendation is really to be upfront about what you know and don't know, but also remind people of a sense of scale. So, for example, when it comes to adverse reactions to vaccines, be trying to convey as clearly as possible the rarity of these effects when they do occur, without negating them. And by the way, we are moderating a discussion with the Office of the Surgeon, the Surgeon General tomorrow at 10:15 PST. So we're going to have a conversation about what it's like to, build a healthy information environment during a pandemic, and the question of the management of an evolving scientific consensus will be part of the themes we'll cover. We'll probably drop a link somewhere. Our third recommendation is to use data wisely. Data figures are an extremely important part, of course, of any messaging around health and science more broadly. However, figures alone cannot do the job. And that is for several reasons. First of all, they're often misunderstood. The sense of scale may be lost. If you talk about several dozens of incidents, this may seem huge, when in fact, on the scale of the vaccination effort, it's quite negligible. Second, the credibility of figures and data is often questioned. One example of this has been mentioned before by Zareen, I think, is the VAERS database on adverse effects, which has been questioned on numerous grounds, and more broadly, any piece of data that is advanced by authorities will be questioned by people who resist the scientific consensus and the mainstream public health discourse. So it's important to embed it in a story that makes sense, to embed it in an argument. Finally, the fourth point, and this is really crucial in our understanding of this, is to adapt the content to context and communities. The anti-vax messaging is very often quite tailored to specific communities, whether it be parents, whether it be linguistic communities, and the most effective counter messaging really goes at the heart of those communities and offers the most effective counter messaging always comes from peers. So the tone and the way you convey the message is key to reaching your audience in any context, but even more so in this very fraught context. And to speak about this more eloquently than I could, we have Dr. Atul Nahazi from This Is Our Shot joining us, and I'll hand it over to him.
Thank you, Zoe, much appreciated, and good to see common colleagues here, Estelle, Willie, as well as Michelle Davis on the call, and thank you to Virality Project and our Stanford colleagues, Elena, Zoe, Chase, the whole team, Renee, have been fantastic partners with This Is Our Shot for the last 6 months to help combat these misinformation narratives. So we've been on the generous receiving end of these narratives, and then what? And so that's where our coalition of healthcare heroes has come into play to help take this information and really use it on the ground, both in communities and clinics, but also digitally across Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. And so just to share a little bit about how we do that. So we have our fantastic partners, Virality, as well as CDC Insights team that does detection and monitoring. So we receive once a week, Zoe's always in my inbox on Tuesday morning with the Virality Project report, Zoe and Chase. And so we have the key takeaways from the tremendous detection and monitoring work of Virality Project. Our team of physicians looks at those takeaways and helps decide what is the key message this week we want to unite around to combat the most trending misinformation across social media platforms. And so it starts with detection and monitoring to really understand what are these misinformation narratives that are spreading and emerging, and then developing counter messaging. And this has two folds to it. It has preemptive cognitive inoculation. How do you get ahead of misinformation narratives so that the cognitive anchor is already in a positive frame before the misinformation gets there? So you have this cognitive inoculation, preemptive messaging, and then you have this reactive counter messaging technique. And so we use both of these mental schemas in order to develop our messages, preemptive and reactive. And then we recruit the trusted messengers in digital spaces, largely physicians, nurses, and pharmacists. Individuals, we know that data has shown that 8 out of 10 patients will turn to their personal healthcare provider to make the decision on the vaccine. So we recruit and then train these heroes on how to deploy these messages in digital spaces through posts, videos, images, and then ultimately also in conversation in their own clinics. And so we kind of have this paradigm of assessing, detecting, message creation, hero recruitment and training, and then their activation digitally and in the community. And this has come into play. I'll just share a quick couple points here. I was just in clinic yesterday, and it's tremendous to see just how misinformation is so much perpetuated, even now 7-8 months into vaccination efforts in the United States. It continues to be a major issue. Yesterday, I had a patient, a Latina mother of mine, who was so nervous about the vaccine. And I asked her why. I said, why? What are your thoughts about the vaccine? And she was very authentic, very genuine in her concern and honest with me. And she just said, Dr. Nakasi, my grandson has autism, and my daughter said, he shouldn't receive the vaccine and it's not good for autistic children. And that scared me. And then she said, and Dr. Nakasi, I saw a video of nurses shaking after the vaccine. Do you want to see it? And it was fascinating. She actually just was about to pull out her phone to show me that initial video where there was a mild syncopal event, just a passing out from a vasovagal attempt, not related to the vaccine, of that initial nurse that received the vaccine very early on in December. That video 7 months later was so memorable, so visual to her, that she declined the vaccine from me just yesterday in my clinic in South Los Angeles. And so it shows the power of these misinformation narratives to be sticky, memorable, visual, and ultimately change the beliefs and attitudes of our patients in a way that has made it challenging in many ways to promote vaccination. So that was just one narrative, but that's a story we see day in and day out still. The other quick narrative I'll say is that I had a patient who literally had COVID himself, and almost succumbed to it. And yet he was very, very fearful that he would have a similar type of experience with the vaccine. And so one theme I'm noticing is that there's oftentimes the fear of the vaccine outweighs the fear of the virus in many of the conversations we're seeing on the ground. And it's oftentimes these misinformation narratives that are fueling and feeding these fears of the vaccine, when indeed it should be the reverse, that the fear of the virus far, far outweighs the fear of the vaccine. So that is a common parallel that this misinformation has fueled, is a changing in risk perception that is not accurate to the science and to the reality of the benefits of the vaccine and safety of it. So that's just a short kind of parallel from on the ground in clinic as a primary care doc, which I'm sure many of you public health officials and healthcare providers can relate to. And then just the last slide here we can go to just to share some insights. Tangibly, how do we take this tremendous work our Virality colleagues and partners have done over this entire year? So this is a very tangible example I wanted to share to kind of make it concrete and crystallize this idea of how we use misinformation narratives from the detection and monitoring. So we just got, or I get a report every Tuesday in my inbox, as I mentioned. One of the recent reports, and you'll see it here, is that there was this male infertility narrative of mass male infertility that was going to happen with the vaccine. And so the VP, the Virality Project weekly briefing, you can see here on the screen, I'll just read the first line of it. It said, a new and sensational false narrative that vaccines cause mass male infertility has spread on social media this week. So this was one of the key takeaways we get on a weekly basis from our colleagues here. And then we take this, our executive messaging team of healthcare providers, and develop the counter messaging. So this is an example of how we countered this narrative. You'll notice the graphic there. I'll just read it real quickly. It says, it's in small print, but it says tidy whities. You can see that picture of underwear there. Tidy whities can affect male infertility. And then the COVID-19 vaccine is the next picture. It says, does not affect male infertility. And the message that went with this is, there are a few things that have been shown to affect male fertility, but the COVID-19 vaccine is not one of them. Trust science, wear boxers, and get vaccinated. And so we developed this message, and I'll break it down just briefly. It's a bit of a humorous message, but we've looked at the academic science and literature, what makes narratives sticky and viral and memorable. And there are key components that the literature has elucidated. So I remember it as an acronym called E-bump, E for electronic, bump because it bumps up your content in the algorithm. So E-bump is an easy way to remember it. The E stands for emotional. We know content that is more eliciting of anger, anxiety, surprise has a 20 to 30% bump in its spread, and social rebroadcasting in the algorithms. So emotional. B is bottom line. Messages with a gist or bottom line spread 2.5 times faster than messages without a key bottom line. U is useful. Is it useful knowledge, practically valuable, that could change your actions or behaviors or attitudes? Useful knowledge spreads faster than knowledge that's less practical. And then M in the bump is meme-like. Is it a humorous connection to culture? Memes and those humorous connections tend to spread faster. And then P, the last one, is positive. Positive messages spread faster than negative messages. So we think when we develop our counter messages, how are we incorporating these principles, the E-bump principles, into our messaging? In this specific example, it really leveraged M, the meme-like humorous culture to connection to whitey type, potentially the relationship there to infertility based on the scrotum being closer to the body and the body temperature being higher and that not being well for sperm. That evidence that, has been mixed, but based on that meme-like cultural reference, we played to that. And then also it's a positive message. It's not creating fear through male infertility issues. It's more of a positive one. Trust science, where boxers get vaccinated. And so we've leveraged several of those principles in the counter messaging we think about, because the fact is we have to be more viral than the misinformation. The pro information, the accurate information has to be just as good. We have not got into those millions of views with that magnetic example just shown earlier today, but that is our challenge as scientists, as medical practitioners, as trusted messengers. How do we get to the point where we've developed that science of creating sticky pro-vaccination messages that can spread and be the anchoring cognitive framework for how patients decide vaccine or no vaccine? Turn it back to you, Virality Project.
Thank you, Dr. Nakasi. So this is where I think in most circumstances we would say sign up for our newsletter and look out for our weekly emails. But the fact is that when we set out to do this project, we planned to end on August 1st. And the reason we picked that date was because it was the projected date when we would have a critical mass of US citizens, eligible US citizens, or US residents vaccinated. We all know that we're not meeting that target as quickly as we wanted, but we are preparing to take this work on to look at the 2022 election. So the best way to hear from us in the coming weeks and months is that we will be posting on our website rapid response when we see breakthrough narratives that we think are particularly critical. And we'll be sharing those as well with our Twitter. And in a second, we'll put up the our URL and the Twitter. And in later November, we will be publishing a final report of all of our findings from this project from between January and the end of July. So we'll encourage people to look to some of the other partners, and we hope that the presentation today serves as somewhat of a learning and education on how we can think about these issues and share messaging out. So if you can put up that last slide, please, Zoe. This is how you can find out our information. Like I said, we will stop our weekly briefings in 2 weeks. All of the briefings are available on our website, and we'll just be moving to publishing breakthrough stories as they feel appropriate for our team. So I will end there, and we can turn it over to question and answer.
All right, thank you folks from the Virality Project and Dr. Nakasi for this fascinating conversation. I know we have few questions that folks have been sharing in the chat box, but again, feel also free to put them in the Q&A box. We have a question from Shannon who asks, are you tracking LinkedIn? She says, I am increasingly seeing anti-vax rhetoric. LinkedIn occasionally removes it, but not always. I'm hearing from others that are frustrated with this as well.
I can jump in real quick there. Yeah, so we have not been tracking LinkedIn. You know, I think as we've been working through all this, we realize the internet is a very big place. So we've been primarily focused on the 4 major platforms: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and well, Reddit, as well as a number of other platforms, Telegram, and TikTok. Sorry, that was the other one. So we've been focused more on those platforms. Haven't looked at LinkedIn specifically, but have seen instances of links shared to us from LinkedIn.
Hey, I think we have another question, and I think with Dr. Nakasi, this may be a good one for you. We have a question from Brooke, who asks, given recent events in Tennessee, what suggestions do you have for public health officials who face vaccine resistance from legislators and politicians? Also opening it up for anybody in the panel who would want to give that a shot.
Thank you, Carlos. I'll just mention, it's been so sad. It's so tragic, the amount of pressure and political pressure we've been seeing, and the injection of politics into public health. We face the same thing. Our Orange County director resigned. I think we had multiple resignations, public health resignations. I know Barbara Ferreira here had been getting all of our health officials. She's the official for LA County Department of Public Health. Lots of pressure from anti-vax individuals, community groups, based on rulings on mask wearing, distancing, vaccination. So it is very, very tough. I think it speaks to the cultural moment we're in that has made this effort all the more challenging. So I wish there were easy answers, easy solutions, but we do need to protect and speak up for science and public health officials. So I think mounting campaigns of support. One quick example I'll give, Shots Heard is an organization one of our colleagues, Dr. Todd Whalen, had formed that gives support to people who've been bullied online digitally or trolled online digitally from anti-vaxxer groups. And so it gives support to healthcare providers, nurses, pharmacists, public health officials who are getting bullied or trolled online and harassed. So we honestly, we need a community that's just as strong and resilient for science, for public health, for people's lives, as we're seeing against the public health officials and what happened in Tennessee.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Nakasi. We have another question from Elia. Do you have any tools or advice for trying to dispel the myth of the 9,000 COVID vaccine deaths reported to VAERS?
Yeah, to the VAERS system. That's a great question, Carlos. I actually will echo what Zoe, Chase, the team said today. I think their point is spot on, that their one in their slide about the 4 ways to counter misinformation, go back to the themes. I have noticed as a clinician, when I directly talk about microchips, or when I talk about how right, a lot of narratives on how fast this vaccine was developed, or what's in it, or can you trust it, or I had a patient tell me the other day that all 3 of the people they knew, like 3 people they had heard of, had all died after they got their second dose. That was a narrative I had heard from my own patient. And it is very difficult to counter narratives that specifically that are really embedded in that person's perception of truth and reality. So I actually recommend, as a narrative technique, don't dig deeper into that narrative. Many times it can actually just backfire, and actually that person doubles down into it. I actually suggest what Zoe had mentioned on the slides, zoom back out and present the big picture again, the key themes. So one quick example I've been doing the narratives of, oh, this person had died right after the vaccine, or 9,000 people died, or this person I had one patient tell me their friend developed a rash for 6 months that persisted right after they got vaccinated. But I step back and give broader themes that the vaccine will save their lives, and I give them clear evidence very succinctly. One example I've been using recently is that 99% of all US COVID deaths in the last month were in unvaccinated individuals, and the Delta virus is getting stronger and stronger day by day. And so it's urgent that we vaccinate you. That resonates more because it changes the risk perception. The virus is risky. The vaccination is safe. Everyone who's died has been unvaccinated, which is true in the last several months in the United States, 99%. So that's an example of going from incident to zoom out, thematic, presenting evidence, and moving that decision point towards pro-vaccination.
Thank you, Dr. Nakasi. I think one other question that may be useful for you to also take on is, do you have any advice for communications organizations in global health working on policy and advocacy surrounding COVID-19, specifically relating to vaccine education efforts? Wondering any tools or resources that you've consulted in your own work that would be helpful for others to also know about.
Definitely. One of the biggest needs we've seen in partnership with Stanford University and the Virality Project is that even providers are not always trained in how to have effective conversations. And they need tools, tips, techniques on how to really do this in a standardized and highly efficacious way. So as public health leaders, as state leaders, equipping your workforce, your nurses, pharmacists, frontline workers with the right tools is so important so they can be most effective. I'll be honest, I don't think I ever got training in vaccine conversations in my 4 years of med school and my 3 years of residency, and now my multiple years of practicing. So the reality is it is not always a well-trained skill, even amongst medical professionals, and it can be learned. So I would actually, one quick set of tools, we use research done by Ad Council and COVID Collaborative. They have messaging tip sheets for different audiences too, for rural audiences, Latino audiences, Black audiences. They have a diversity of messaging tip sheets. And then I can put it in the link, www.thisisourshot.info. Under our resources, become an advocate link, we have a messaging conversation guide. It's just 2 pages, but it says the do's and don'ts of how to message the vaccine and the key messages that resonate with individuals to move them towards pro-vaccination. So it's a 2-page guide that we compiled from quantitative, qualitative research to give providers those tools. So I'll put that in the link, but that is a big need to really do that training and equip our workforce to be advocates for the vaccine.
Thank you, Dr. Nakasi. I think we have a few other questions that also for the Virality Project folks. We have one from Delaney, who asks, in terms of fighting vaccine misinformation, what is one of the most hopeful things your group thinks about fighting it or preventing it?
I hope our silence isn't taken to mean that we're not hopeful. I think seeing the tools work, seeing this is our shot. Seeing the collaboration across all society collaboration has really been a core of both, as Elena was explaining, the election work and now the vaccine work, and seeing that work effectively gives me personally a lot of hope for a model which can hopefully move forward. Yeah, Elena, did you have anything to add there?
I'm not sure how hopeful this is, but with both the vaccine project and the elections project, we sat down before the project began and thought about what we expected some of the common narratives and tropes to be. And for the most part, everything we've seen has fallen into that. So I would say that the individual stories may be new, but the themes and approaches are still the same. And so we can build on the corpus of knowledge we've already got on communicating and research and data collection to figure out how to message around those narratives.
Thank you.
And one little tidbit that makes me personally hopeful is that we've been compiling, the most shared posts on all social media about that included the word vaccine. And when I started the Virality Project, there were mostly anti-vax discourse, and today we find, more and more positive discourse, at least on Facebook and in Instagram. So more and more often we'll find information from public health institutions or positive content by celebrities around the world getting their first or second shot, and those get more shares. Also, lots of counter messaging initiatives, including This Is Our Shot, and also a number of individual doctors who have taken to social media to educate the public. So, yeah, that makes me hopeful.
Thank you, Zoe. I think we have another question from Nina. She asks, are there particular audiences you're seeing as especially susceptible or vulnerable to getting swayed by anti-vaxxers, or particular qualities in people that anti-vaccine people try to target?
Yeah, I'll probably preface that, and Chase is welcome to jump in as well. I'll preface that by saying that, it's actually quite hard. It's not as easy as one might think to categorize audiences and to say, oh, these are susceptible. There might be, for example, a preconception that, right-wing audiences are more susceptible to anti-vax discourse. It's not that simple. Actually, some of the one of the greatest or most followed anti-vax influencers right now is Robert Kennedy Jr. So I think I'll preface this by saying it's not one particular social, political, group that is being targeted. Now that said, we have a number of communities that we follow, and those include minorities, whether rural, Black, Asian, Latino. We also look at the parenting and wellness universe in general, which is one that is quite susceptible to anti-vax discourse, and we also look at political communities, both on the right and on the left. So those are examples of arenas where these narratives spread. And in terms of the characteristics, I mean, the research is kind of inconclusive as to what specific types of people are most susceptible to disinformation. Generally, not exclusively on vaccines. There is some research suggesting that the more isolated you are, the less access you have to information and resources, perhaps as a lack of education, the more you're susceptible to disinformation. But really, the research is not conclusive, and we haven't found anything that allows us to definitively support that. So yeah, just my message would be perhaps many of the preconceptions you're likely to have about what audiences are most susceptible to this are likely to be untrue.
Thank you. All right. Not seeing any additional question. Are there any other questions folks have? Please drop it in now in the chat or in the Q&A box. One question that I had in mind is, and for folks in the Virality Project, for also Dr. Cassidy, what has been one thing that has surprised you the most by doing this kind of work over the past year?
I'm happy to call us all for brief insight, and then our Virality friends can chime in. I just say people's hopefulness still to do what's right for themselves and their family. you know, we talk a lot about misinformation, and all of us are steeped deep into that world. You know, we've been fighting this for quite some time. But I would still say that, you know, when the patient's right in front of me in clinic, when I'm in South Los Angeles in clinic, at the end of the day, that you look at them in the eyes and there's this still deep, deep desire to just do what's right and needed to protect themselves and their family. And so the one thing that has positively surprised me is that every single individual, no matter how much misinformation, no matter how much the fight seems almost like we're drowning in a sea of misinformation, everyone has a personally compelling reason to be vaccinated.
Mhm.
Everyone. And the key for us providers is unlocking that personal reason. So one quick technique that I often do with my patients that has positively surprised me is they'll say, "Doc, I'm scared of the vaccine. You know, I'm scared of the blood clot from the Johnson & Johnson, or the myocarditis, or the nurse who's syncopized." They'll have their narrative. And I'll ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to get the vaccine? And they'll say, "Well, I'm only a 3. I'm only a 3, Dr. Nakasi." And I'll say, "Well, how come you're not a 1?
Mm.
And they'll tell me why they aren't a 1 and why they might get the vaccine. And that is the start of unlocking their personal motivation to get vaccinated and changing the frame from that fear-based belief of the vaccine to a route to, I want my children back in school. I want to get back to work, have my dignity back, my income back, my support for my family back. I want to hug my mother again without fear of hospitalizing her. You'll unlock that reason. And that has positively, persistently surprised me. Everyone has that reason. The question is, can we find it?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating and very much in line with our own research. We're finding people have genuine, valid concerns, and addressing those in the way that you just explained, I think, is a really fantastic way to do so. Here's for any of the Virality Project folks, anything that has surprised you in your work?
It's a bit hard because obviously it's going to sound a little less positive than what Dr. Nahazi just shared, but it's more about what I've been surprised at is the constancy of many of these themes, and as Chase mentioned earlier, like the relative lack of creativity, or rather the the permanence of certain tropes, and how they just keep being readjusted to fit the news. So for example, how they are adapted to the Delta variant, or how a shedding narrative is adapted once it's been debunked for fertility. It's being adjusted and used for another purpose. So I would say the constancy of those was something that I found striking, and there is a glimmer of hope there, because it means that there's a finite number of ideas that people crazy ideas that people can come up with regarding the vaccine. So if we manage to debunk those, then one could hope that we'll make some progress.
Any of the other Virality Project folks?
This isn't so directly related to the project, but I live here in San Francisco, and it's just been really rewarding to see how the COVID rates have dipped as the vaccine rates have gone up in the city. And I mean, this is the sort of separating the individual cases from the overall trends is important. And I mean, there is hope from science, and things are working.
Right. Any other questions from our attendees? Not seeing any. Caroline, did I miss any in the chat? Okay, we have one from Nicole. Scale of 1 to 10. Why are you not a 1? This is genius. Thank you. Yes. I think, Dr. Nakasi, that will prove a very popular way to have those conversations.
Yeah, and just a reminder about the event tomorrow with the Surgeon General that the Virality Project is going to have, and I just popped the link in the chat as well. Sounds like it'll be really great, so thank you all.
Right. Thank you all for the Virality Project folks. Zoe, Serene, Chase, Elena, Dr. Nakasi, thank you all for being here today. We greatly appreciate your time and input and sharing all of the amazing lessons you all have shared today. Thank you. And thanks all for attending today, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks in our next webinar. Thank you all.